you wake up one day and just realize I am where I am at the speed in which I got there, not because I'm the smartest person or the most gifted person. I had some people open doors for me, and I wanted to pay that forward. And so that's really all that was when you talk about the Chris Davises and the Brandon Woodards and the Derek Puckett, so on and so forth. I was just like, I want to do for them what had been done for me. And in a lot of ways, that's what discipleship is, right? So, yeah.
You got to tell the story, Doc.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Tell the Story Doc on All of Life TV. I am Byron, and we're getting started with our second season of Tell the Story Doc. And I don't know if there's a better way to start with Dr. Bryan Loritts. So I'm excited to have Dr. Bryan Loritts with us this day. Let me just say, he took his time to join the podcast or have a conversation with me on MLK Day. And I don't know how I feel about setting him up that way. We should be kicking back on MLK Day.
Right.
But I appreciate the fact that you would take the time out. And I know that you have looked to the life of MLK a lot in your ministry career. You've written a book or been a part of a book that spoke on MLK. And then I am a big fan of looking to see what you've read, because I know that you're a reader. And you read the King book that came out last year, right?
Mm-hmm.
What did you think of that?
Absolutely. Read it and interviewed him. So Jonathan Eig is one of my favorite modern day biographers. I was first introduced to him. He wrote a wonderful biography on Muhammad Ali that came out a couple years ago, I think 2017, 18, something like that. So King, like anybody else, is complicated, nuanced. I mean, that's me, that's you. There's some things about the challenge with King is, I think, more than any other person that you would write on, and I know that's a heck of a statement, is to hold that tension between human and hero. And King's humanity runs deep in some places that makes a lot of people feel uncomfortable. And so some people so focus in on the humanity of King that to read them, it feels a little bit tabloidish. And then some people just sanitize King to where he's not just a real person. Right. I was just with Charlie Dates a couple weeks ago, and we were talking about Jonathan Eig's biography. And I really feel like he holds that tension well. Good. Where he's not afraid of the humanity, writes on it, but it's not a gotcha piece either. So Jonathan did his thing on this.
Good. I bought it. I have not read it yet. It's a thick read. I'm a church planter.
Yes. A
little bit longer to read through some of that stuff. We always start with some type of personal connection. I'm glad we got to talk about Jonathan Eig's book. I'm glad you got an opportunity to interview him as well. But we always start with some level of personal story, and you and I have sat at a table once before and had a good conversation. But I'm going to start here. 2015, my wife and I packed up, leaving Daytona Beach to move to Tennessee, thinking I was going to join Bryan Loritts. The church you were serving at there. And I've never gotten a chance to tell you this, but for a long time, my fist has been like the little Arthur fist, that meme. And I'm like, man, I just missed him. You left a great legacy behind. I think the scripture where they say, entrust these things to faithful men, right? And those men that you impacted, they poured into me in my 2 years in Memphis, Tennessee. So thank you for all that you did for, Chris Davis and Brandon Woodard and Brandon Porter and Russell McCutcheon, all of whom have taught me a lot and helped grow me in ministry and direct me in the way. Hassan Salim and many others. So this podcast is a conversation called Tell the Story Doc. So I have to ask you, where do you believe your story began? Can you give us kind of a look into your story? How would you, if Jonathan Eig was writing your biography, what would that look like?
Yeah, I think, the place where most biographies begin, right? It begins with my family, with my home. We may even take it back before that, As a black man, it's rare that I can trace my legacy to pre-emancipation days. I mean, you know anything about history of the United States. They just didn't keep good records on black people. But I can trace mine all the way back. My great-great-grandfather was a slave in Asheville, North Carolina, loved Jesus, loved his wife, and we can trace it all the way down. In my direct line, it's just crazy to even say this, there's no such thing as a black man who didn't love Jesus or a black man who divorced his wife.
Wow.
So in my direct line, there's no such thing as divorce, going all the way back to the 1800s, and there's no such thing as someone not loving Jesus. So, man, that's a heck of a burden. You know what I'm saying? But it's a joyful burden that I'm always conscious of. Growing up, it was just rare. Both my parents loved Jesus. Were in vocational ministry. Modeled before me and my siblings what authentic Christianity looks like. They will celebrate in 3 or 4 months 53 years of marriage. So, man, my father, I like to say, was my first preaching professor, my first Old Testament professor, New Testament professor. Every single week, he would just sit me down at a breakfast table somewhere, McDonald's or whatever, and he would teach me the scriptures. And, for those of you who are listening, chances are that's not your testimony. And if you feel a little deflated, I would say start your own legacy. So that 100 and something years from now, your great whatever is able to say, this is kind of how I got to where I am today. So, and then, I'm summarizing a lot of stuff, but when I turned 17, I always knew intuitively that I was going to preach, that vocational ministry was where I'd end up. I couldn't tell you an exact moment, but I officially embraced that call when I was 17. There was this guy in high school that I felt unusually led to share the gospel with, named Craig Tarleton, collapsed and died of a heart attack. I remember sitting in his funeral and just saying, for the first time in my life, I'm face to face with mortality. I'm looking at a casket with a 17-year-old dude in there, just going, I better get serious about my life. So, being the son of a preacher, what immediately happens is I end up preaching my first sermon. Then all my dad's friends who loved my dad as their way of saying thank you to my dad start inviting me to come preach at their churches. I got opportunities I should never have gotten, not because of any skill or whatever that I had, but because of who my dad was. Go off to Bible college, and then dad starts handing me off to his friends. So I interned under Tony Evans, which was amazing, and traveled with him and just gleaned a bunch of stuff. Spent 3 years with my godfather, Bishop Ulmer, and gleaned from him. So I had a ton of doors open for me. We can pick it up from there, but that's just kind of how the journey started.
I like sports. I'm a basketball guy, and I grew up in North Carolina. So, a place that you spend a good amount of time, your family's from. And as you were talking, I was thinking about Steph Curry and how Steph has turned into, or is, however you want to say it, the greatest shooter ever, but he had a good head start. And it's not his fault, right? He took advantage of the doors that were open for him. He took advantage of the conversations that were happening around him, and that helped him form his craft and helped him become one of the greatest that we'll ever see. And I think there's a correlation there. Would you say?
Absolutely. And, you had even mentioned earlier on, some of the young men at Fellowship who I had the opportunity, the privilege of being able to deposit some things in, who actually turned around and encouraged you. Well, the whole kind of genesis behind that was you wake up one day and just realize I am where I am at the speed in which I got there, not because I'm the smartest person or the most gifted person. I had some people open doors for me, and I wanted to pay that forward. And so that's really all that was when you talk about the Chris Davises and the Brandon Woodards and the Derek Puckett, so on and so forth. I was just like, I want to do for them what had been done for me. And in a lot of ways, that's what discipleship is, right? So, yeah.
I love all that. One thing I want to point to in that story, you said, both of your parents were believers. They worked in vocational ministry. I've heard you do interviews and have conversations in the past. One thing I always love hearing you talk about is many people give honor to your father, but I've often heard you give a lot of honor to your mother and the impact that she's had on your life. Could you just share a couple words about, how she impacted your faith walk and even you moving into vocational ministry?
Yeah. So, my parents' stories are just radically different, So again, when I talk about my family legacy and lineage, my dad grows up in a home where both parents are there, they're going to church. That's not my mom. Whatever your image of the ghetto is, that was my mom. Father was never around. Her mom battled her own addiction demons, threw my mother through a window one day, yada, yada, yada. Well, she comes to know Christ as Lord and Savior. Of course, the gospel does what it always does. It radically changed her life. She ends up going to Bible college, meets my father one of her first days at Bible college. That begins a courtship. 10 months later, they get married. And so I say that to say my mom did not come, she didn't have this like cultural Christianity kind of a thing. Everything was fresh for her. So there was a vibrancy and authenticity about her expression of faith that was just, it was a little rough around the edges. She didn't know how to play the game. And yet every single morning I just have vivid memories of seeing her at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, Bible open, prayer journal. To this day, I posted about it recently. I can count on a card from her every single January, in which she's reflecting on what she saw God do in my life last year. A verse or verses she's praying for me this year. So she really showed me and gave me the blueprint, even in what to look for in a wife, right? And so her mark on me is indelible.
Yeah, I love seeing. I follow you much like many other people. I love seeing when you post pictures of your family and even your siblings who are following Jesus and working in ministry and all of that. And it always just impresses upon me when my wife and I are talking through things that our marriage really does matter. And the way that we follow Jesus in our marriage really does matter. So thank you for sharing that with the world, because it really does encourage me. Another thing I love is you are very open and honest about the impact of fatherhood and your dad being around, and not just being around, but being present, not just being present, but being active, challenging you in a lot of different ways, but his imprint being on you, so much so that you would write a book about fatherhood.
Right.
As you are, we could talk ministry all day, but as you've pastored in a lot of places, you've been a part of church plants and all of that, do you feel like you're moving into this age of like, you're the father, like you have 3 boys yourself, but right. men now yourself, but do you feel like you're entering into that like spiritual father age, or the age that just kind of push fathering a lot further in this world of ministry?
Yeah, for sure. There's in fact, I'm going to be speaking on this at a men's conference, a couple of men's conferences coming up. There's 5 stages of a man's life. And you've got to be able to recognize what stage you're in. And one of them speaks to what you're talking about. So there's the boyhood stage. Next is the adolescent stage. Then there's the manhood stage. And then the 4th stage is mentor, right? And the whole idea of, that's a little bit more info than what you want. 5th stage is patriarch. And so, I think when Paul is actually writing Timothy, and he's calling him in 2 Timothy to step up and embrace manhood, right? And he's looking at Timothy, and Timothy, he's got a fearful disposition to him. Paul tells Timothy, hey man, God hadn't given us a spirit of fear. I think we also catch a glimpse of that when Paul tells Timothy, drink a little wine for your stomach, right? So he's constantly calling him to courage. And I think one of the things Paul models for us is the absolute importance. I would actually say it's an essential Manhood isn't it isn't inherited, it's imprinted.
Hmm.
There needs to be other men who come alongside of you and really speak life into you and call you up.
Wow.
And I don't want to discourage, because a lot of men, they don't know anything about that. It doesn't have to be biological, is what I'm saying, right? You can solicit and recruit your own mentors who can call you up. And I've always been good at seeking out mentors and patriarchs, but there does come a point when you're in your 40s, typically, where you're so used to bringing your own questions and your pen and paper, and then you get to the table and realize, wow, like they're the ones asking questions now, right? And you just got to embrace it. You just absolutely positively have to embrace it, and I think that's the way you make the most of it.
No, that's good. That's good. You mentioned something that I think is important. I feel like I've heard you talk about this or maybe tweet about this at one time in that searching for mentors, because a lot of guys, especially in ministry, Black men in ministry who are attempting to do ministry a certain type of way, especially if you're not in that traditional Black church space, you kind of have a hard time finding mentors. Like, what would you say is the best way to do that? I said in a previous podcast, everybody can't call Eric Mason and Brian Laritz and Charlie Dates for everything. How do you find, solid mentors that are actually accessible, but equipped enough to pour into you well?
Well, you have to be in the right environment, right? Like, I wouldn't recommend going to the club praying that you'll find a mentor at the club, right? Not to say there aren't good people at the club, but that's a bit of an overstatement. So I think finding the right environment, one of the right environments to do that is the local church. And I would lovingly say, if you're not in somebody's local church, get your behind in a local church, right? And that's really, really key, because I think it's just an interesting phenomenon in this celebrity culture. When me and Eric get together, and some other people, one of the things that we talk about is how so many people that we've never even seen before, but who have access to us via social media, are asking us to mentor them.
Yeah.
And I don't really do much of that anymore, right? Because that's what the local church is for.
Right.
And don't pit me or Eric or anybody else against your pastor, right? And so you need to be sitting in somebody's local church, and you need to be showing up, being faithful, and then you need to be quietly going through a discernment process. I wouldn't just roll up on somebody after one interaction and say, "Will you mentor me?" Mm-hmm. I would just quietly, prayerfully discern, and then I would invite them out for something, coffee, breakfast, whatever that may be. You should pay, and preemptively say, I want to just ask you some questions, and maybe you want to be specific. Questions about manhood, questions about being a father, questions about whatever it may be. Come prepared, because there's nothing worse. I've had this happen to me before, when someone invites me out and yet you're just kind of small talking and you're like, okay, we ever going to get to it? And then finally, I would say, don't declare the relationship. So we talk about a DTR, define the relationship. It's sort of like going out on a first date with a woman and, declaring your intentions and, this is going to be for marriage and all that other stuff. You'll scare a lot of people off doing that.
Right.
See if there's chemistry there, and just be prayerful and see what the Lord, but chances are you're going to have to initiate that process.
Yeah. Yeah. I've learned that over time. I've also learned, sometimes it's not the guy that's most visible that you should be running after. Sometimes there's another really faithful guy who is right there in front of you that you could learn from and would be a better fit. I would imagine that a lot of people, if they're asking you to mentor them, would ask you to mentor them in the area of preaching. Am I right about that?
I get a little bit of that. Yeah, sure.
So a lot of people ask questions about what makes a good preacher. And a lot of people look at you as being a good preacher. I could guess some of the things that God has used in your life to make you a good preacher. You mentioned some of them. I mean, sheer legacy, being that close to your father, who is a good preacher, all of his friends who are good preachers as well, the many, many reps that you get. What would you say are the things that are like markers for good preachers today?
Yeah, so obviously giftedness, there's a place for that. I think even above giftedness is a sense of, what we might call anointing, God's hand, God's call. It's just amazing how many preachers I've listened to over the years who are not technically good preachers. Like they don't, the formula but what makes them great preachers is just the hand of God is on them. Yeah. Right. And so I think there's that. I think closely related to that is that a person whose preaching emerges out of an authentic life of following Jesus. I would say that's right there at the top of the list, that how I live actually impacts the quality of my preaching. Yeah. Right. And then we can get into technical stuff. I think great preachers take it seriously. And so there's an intentionality, there's a focus, there's a discipline where they are engaged in the study of the text, and they take their time seriously devoted to studying the text and always working on their craft. It's really no different than, I don't know if you've seen old interviews of Kobe Bryant, right? Mm-hmm. And just the incredible unceasing work ethic that he had until the day he retired. Right. You know what I'm saying? And so I think it's Malcolm Gladwell. He wrote a book called Outliers years ago. It's what he calls the 10,000 hour rule. Right. And one of the things he's trying to argue, it's the main thing he's trying to argue in that book, is that greatness is not a matter of giftedness as much as it is just hard work. Mm-hmm. And so now we're getting into getting your reps. Tim Keller says that the first 200 times you preach, you're going to be terrible. There's a lot of truth to that, but sticking to it, getting feedback, soliciting feedback, I can talk on and on and on for days, but I think those are some things that'll position you well.
Yeah. I want to know your thoughts on this, because this is one thing my wife and I talk about a lot. I have another podcast with a friend of mine. We talk about this a lot. That here, I'm just going to say it as clear, as raw as I can say it. I think that the person who's willing to put in the 10,000 hours, that is a gift in itself, right? Like the person who does not have that gift will never put that amount of time in, right? So like Beyonce is good in what she does, one, because she's talented, but her gift is that she will continue on in it regardless. Kobe is good. Yeah, he's talented. He has something special. But there's another gift there that kind of keeps him in it so that he won't quit. In a time that I'm seeing a lot of guys quit, I'm wondering if they have that first thing you're talking about, that anointing and that gifting, that true gifting. Because in my mind, and this, I could be wrong about this completely, if you really had that, you would put in the 10,000 hours. You wouldn't quit this thing and move to something else so swiftly, because you're talking 10,000 hours. That's not 3 or 4 years. That's decades, right? For some guys. What are your thoughts on that? That's just my theory, that in itself is a part of that gifting or that anointing.
Yeah, so I definitely think there's a point to what you're saying. I would just use a different word. So you're not going to put 10,000 hours in anything unless you are, and here's the different word I would use, passionate about it. Mm-hmm. So, and I know I'm splitting hairs. I think gifts and passion do go together. But look, Kobe loves basketball. Yeah. Right? Like, it's just in his DNA. It's in his blood. And if it was just something he was interested in, he wouldn't invest to the level in which he invested when he was on this earth. Okay. And I think that's across the board, whether or not it's singing and Beyonce or preaching, whatever it is, your passion will bear itself out in how you allocate and spend time,
Mhm.
right? So yeah, I think your hypothesis is experientially true.
I like passion. Yeah, I like subbing that word out for passion. I think that does make it flow a little bit better.
Yeah.
Good preaching, anointing comes first. That is that is good, because a lot of times
Yep.
you can write all these technical things, but is a brother anointed or not?
Yep.
And that determines so much on the path. Do you believe that we need to teach more of that, especially in some of our more conservative spaces? And I don't speak politically, but like theologically, preach a little bit more of that in those spaces, so that as people are pursuing not just preaching, pastoring, church planting, all of that, so that they're aware, yeah, not only is it the power of God, but it's like God has specifically anointed you for this thing so that you can do it for the long haul.
Oh, for sure. But I think, yes. I think part of the problem today is church planting is really the wild, wild west, meaning that anybody can call themselves to plant a church, right? And I think what's missing in this age of autonomy is really what Paul told Timothy. He says, Timothy, 2 Timothy chapter 1, stir up the gift that is in you through the laying on of our hands. The idea being is, Timothy, there was a community of believers who got alongside of you and laid hands on you, both validating and affirming the giftedness, along with commissioning you and sending you out. So a lot of times, man, I look at people and I go, who laid hands on you?
Yep.
Like who goes, yeah, no. I spent time with this person. I've seen them in action. I've invested in them. I've poured into them. I've seen the character. I've seen the humility. I've seen the giftedness. Of course, we're not talking about perfect people, but I vouch for that person. Too many, and I especially see it in church planting, too many church planters, they do an assessment, but I don't know who their spiritual father is. I don't know who came alongside of them and said, we're sending you out. We're putting our hands on you. We're commissioning you to this work. And that's a problem, man. That is a real problem. And we got to do better with that in a million different directions. We just got to do better.
Yeah, as a young church planter, and I mean, I've been doing this our church has been around for 5 years. We started the church planting journey in 2015. Part of the reason why we were going to Tennessee is so that we could have more eyes on us, right? But I have seen how easy it is to, especially be a Black church planter looking to plant a multi-ethnic church, to just kind of slip through the cracks and not really have anyone vouch.
Right.
You're a halfway decent preacher. You can gather a few people. And the world of church planting has kind of gotten out of the business of fathering as much, just from what I've seen and experienced. And it's more about, okay, how much money can be raised? How many people can this person attract? Where's this person going? And it's more about the church planting project than it is about faithful men, and in some cases, faithful men and women. We're talking about the holistic church laying on hands and sending out those that they love for the sake of the mission of Christ. And as a young guy, I'm like, I don't know what to do about that besides try to be faithful myself and implement that in my later years, in saying like, no, we're only sending out men who we love and trust and feel called by God to send out. So
right. Well, the great thing about spiritual fathering, which, by the way, that's all 2 Timothy is, right? I mean, 2 Timothy chapter 1, he calls him my child. The great thing about that is You might be listening to this podcast going, wow, I never put that together. I kind of ended up as a church planter, not out of a sense of rebellion, but nobody really fathered me. Nobody really sent me out. You can recruit that, though. It's never too late to find somebody in your context that you really admire and respect. Begin nurturing a relationship with them, inviting them to speak into some stuff. And the next thing you know, year, 2, 3 years down the line, they're really your spiritual father. So it's not too late to get that, is what I'm saying.
Right. No, that's good. Speaking of multi-ethnic churches and multi-ethnic ministry and all of that, I know that that's something you're passionate about. You've always been passionate about. You run Kainos Movement, and that is a huge part of the mission, or is the mission, along with just the general mission of seeing people come to know Jesus. You have the podcast that goes along with that, and you've written several books about it. Where are you with your, I would say, just your passionate call that you've received to seeing the church be a multi-ethnic space that looks like heaven?
Yeah, man. So I'm very much still engaged in it. We're launching 4 or 5 cohorts, multi-ethnic church planting cohorts, through the Sin Network this year. So we'll be Boston, the Bay Area, Atlanta, Chicago. And so we're just kind of cycling through. You can find more information about it on the Sin Network. So, man, that's just who I am until the day the Lord Jesus calls me home. So it's not even about results or whatever. There's been times, especially in recent years, where I've wondered, man, how much progress have we really, really made? Mm-hmm. There was a study that came out on multi-ethnic churches, January of 2021, where they looked at the multi-ethnic church in conservative evangelical spaces from 1998 to January 2021. I forget which one exactly. Anyways, multi-ethnic church has grown. It's tripled in conservative evangelical spaces, from 7% in 1998 to 22%. Excuse me. I think it was 2020. Well, the big question mark was, man, how did COVID and the crazy political stuff and racial stuff that happened, how did that impact it? My guess is, and I don't have any objective data outside of my own consulting framework, my guess is we took some steps back. COVID was really hard in a multitude of ways, but especially around aspiring multi-ethnic churches. There was like this, I think it's a mass exodus that took place. And so, yes, there have been times of deep discouragement, like deep, deep, deep discouragement. But it's a calling. It's just what I'm going to do regardless of the results, because the call isn't even to get results. The call is to be faithful. Right. And that's what the Lord's called me to do.
Well, I appreciate that, because it's a lot of people who feel they feel like that time is over, like it was a trend, right? Yep. And I've been encouraged by the fact that you're still with it, and you're still fighting the good fight, and you are helping brothers and sisters that want to fight that good fight on both sides. Yep. And I love all of that. Before I wrap up with you, I do want to talk about your new book. So a few weeks ago, I did see, I'm one of those people who follow your life through social media, that has a little access to you through social media. And I saw a picture that just kind of blessed me. And it was just you with friends of yours. And I also know you get with another set of your friends every year. And when I saw that you were writing this book about friendships, that was, I became very interested. So I'm ready for the book to drop. It's dropping in March. We'll include some information on it in the show notes or whatever. But what drove you to write a book about friendship? Like, what drove you to include that in the list of books that you have already authored?
Yeah, man, I think so every statistical measure, right? Christian, non-Christian, whatever, they all say the same thing. You can draw a straight line between the quality of your relationships and the satisfaction of your life. Straight line. And I think where we miss it, especially as men, this book isn't just for men, by the way, but where we miss it, especially as men, is we think productivity will give us the satisfaction we're looking for. And it's not. So what typically happens with most men is you kind of spend the first, your 20s and 30s especially, you're sprinting up what I call Mount Significance. I want to leave my mark. I want to accomplish. I want to achieve. I want to do all of those things. But once you get in your 40s, there's a necessary pivot you have to make. Arthur Brooks talks about this in his book, Strength to Strength. David Brooks, No Relationship, actually talks about it too in his book, The Second Mountain. And that pivot is from productivity, an emphasis on productivity, to actually relational investment. And I would say, especially peer-wise, and then pouring down into the next generation. I can tell you, I'm 50 years old. The most satisfaction I've ever gotten in ministry, the most, has nothing to do with a sermon I've preached or a book that I've written. It has been always about relationships, whether it's with my wife, with my children, with young men that I've discipled, a mentoring relationship. That's the secret sauce. The problem is, Byron, you know this, people are a trip. They're extremely frustrating because the nature of sin is not just personal, it's profoundly social.
Yep.
Right? Adam and Eve, when they sinned, they hide from each other, they hide from God. So the trick is, how do we nurture and nourish deep friendships over the long haul, if that is really the key to satisfaction in life? And this book really helps us with this by taking a deep dive in a very obscure place in the Bible.
I love it. I love it. Well, I'm looking forward to the book. What's your date?
12th.
March 12th.
March 12th.
Yeah.
Yes.
March 12th.
Yes.
It'll be out. You can pre-order it now. So go ahead and pre-order it on whatever site you like to pre-order your books. I try not to be a Kindle guy. I try to order actual book. But sometimes if I need to read something really quickly, I'll order it on Kindle. We end all of our conversations by doing some quick draw questions, whatever the first thing that comes to your mind is, just throw that out there, and hopefully it's a good answer for you. So you've lived in a couple places, you've done ministry in a couple places, you've been in the South, you've been in the North, you've been in the West. Out of all the cities you've lived in, what city do you like the food best in?
Ooh, New York.
New York. Okay.
Yeah. New York. Yeah.
I talked to Brandon Watts a few weeks ago, and he was telling me, he was like, New York, hands down, has the best food. I'll argue with anybody. So
yeah, Memphis is close. Yeah. Memphis has the best barbecue, and they got a couple chicken spots, but I'm gonna go with New York.
I love it. I love it. All right, you read a lot. You are an avid reader. What's a book that you most often recommend to people? Not your last read or your latest read, but what's one that you've consistently recommended to people?
And I just have to give you one?
You can give a couple.
A.W. Tozer's The Pursuit of God. Philip Yancey's What's So Amazing About Grace.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. I didn't expect the second one.
Yep.
Okay. I love it. All right. One of the posts that I saw from you that I laughed very hard at was the post that you put out about your wife talking about the sermons that you preach.
Yes.
And her trying to police what you could preach.
She got something to say about everything.
So I thought that was just hilarious. But I remember when I was in Memphis, Ricky Jenkins told me, Doc, you got to have three. You got to have three that you're willing to preach all the time. When somebody calls you up, you got to have three. What's your favorite sermon that you preach?
Oh gosh, that's I don't know if I've ever been asked that question. That's I hate that question because I'm my worst critic.
Okay.
Right? I am my worst critic. My favorite sermons that I preach are not so much because they are homiletically tight. but because it has something to do with what's going on in my life, right? So in that sense, that's impossible for me to answer that because I'm like you, like everybody else. I'm in this journey. I'm in this process. Somebody was asking me the other day if I preach stuff at the church I'm at now that I've preached years ago. I go, absolutely not.
Right.
Not out of any ethical concern, but I've looked at. So we've preached passages that I've preached before, and I'll go back and pull those messages up, and I'm like, that's useless because I'm not there anymore, right? The things I would notice or the things I would pull out and say, I'm at a totally different spot. So yeah, I don't think I can answer that, man, because I'm a moving target.
I love it. I love it. I'm glad you answered that way, actually.
Yeah.
I'm glad you didn't just say, hey, I like this one. Boom.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Bishop, Pastor, Dr. Loritts, for taking the time to have a conversation with me. I have watched from afar. I've been blessed to be in a room a couple of times with you. Your reach and what you've invested in so many has touched my life. And I'm glad that we got an opportunity to kind of share this with everyone. If you don't know much about Dr. Loritts, he currently is the executive pastor of teaching, and development at Summit Church in North Carolina. You all are all over North Carolina. He has a preaching ministry. He's in a lot of different places with his preaching ministry. He's an author. He has quite a few books, a lot of them that you need to grab. The latest ones, The Offensive Church, Enduring Friendships is coming out. Kainos Movement. There's just so many things we can list, but I think one of the most impactful things I've seen in your life is just you being a good father, you being a good son, you being a good brother and a good friend. So thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for being on Tell the Story, Doc. We want to make sure that y'all subscribe so y'all can hear more conversations and maybe even another conversation in the future with Dr. Brian Loritts. I'm going to let him go, but thank y'all for watching. God bless.